An Irish friend said to me, please remember one thing. There's no Irish problem, only an English problem. Well, this film is about that English problem. And not so long ago, a distinguished Englishman described the gunmen of Ireland as baboons. Well, this film also explains what made one Irishman named Michael Collins a baboon. Michael Collins' family have lived in this part of County Cork in the Republic of Ireland since the year 1178. He was born in this building. But when he was 9 years old, his father built a larger cottage which stood on this spot. But it was destroyed by English soldiers of the Essex Regiment in the year 1919. As a matter of passing fact, the English soldiers ordered the Collins family, 2 women and 8 children, out of the cottage before burning it to the ground. The soldiers threw everything onto the flames, household effects, baby's cradle, everything. In charge of this typically English military operation in Ireland was a Major A.E. Percival, later to become Lieutenant General Percival, C.B. D.S.O., Order of the British Empire, M.C., the officer who surrendered a British army to the Japanese at Singapore. Anyway, he shouldn't have burned that little farmhouse down. Michael Collins was born in the year 1890. In that year, the great Irish political fighter Charles Stewart Parnell was destroyed by bigoted moralists. And in that year, over large areas of Ireland, famine was oppressing the Irish people. And in the far southwest, no one could know that a bright hope was born. Michael Collins' father was a carpenter. He was impressively 75 years old when Michael was born. He gained a little education from a relative, a wandering hedge schoolmaster. And then in this rustic isolation, after his day's work was done, he pursued his studies and became a scholar of Latin and Greek and of French and English and of his own native Irish, and he became a mathematician. This was the standard of human endeavor that Michael Collins learned to love through his old father. Michael Collins once said, "Great age holds something for me that is awesome. I am much fonder of old people in the darkness than I am of young people in the daylight." I'm wondering if you have to be a Celt to understand that. And what did Michael Collins learn about Ireland's history? He learned about the murderous conquest of the English Elizabethans. He learned about the murderous progress of the English Cromwellians. His grandmother, Joanna O'Brien, told him of the human bodies dead from starvation, which she had seen on the roads around Clonakilty. During his own father's lifetime, well over 1 million Irish people died of starvation under English patronage. And he could see for himself what was happening during his old childhood, the greedy, continuing exploitation of the land by most of the English landlords. And he could see that the options open to many of his native Irish people were still to go to hell or to go to the rocks of Connaught. Or to the United States of America. Oh yes, he was a very angry Irish lad. And Michael Collins learned from his aged father about the lives of the Irish patriots who with suicidal courage had objected. In particular, he digested the significant words of Wolfe Tone. My principle is to subvert the tyranny of our execrable government, to break the connection with England, the never-failing source of all our political evils, and to assert the independence of my country, to unite the whole people of Ireland, and to substitute the common name of Irishman in place of the denomination of Protestant, Catholic, and Dissenter. Wolfe Tone inscribed those clarion words in 1796, inevitably died in an English prison in 1798. Michael Collins went to this school. His schoolmaster, a chap called Dennis Lyons, wrote this astoundingly prophetic report about his 10-year-old pupil. Exceptionally intelligent in observation and at figures. Character good. Able and willing to adjust himself to all circumstances. Displays more than a normal interest in things appertaining to the welfare of his country. Yes, as I said, he was then 10 years old. By this time, his beloved father had died, and Michael had heard him say on his deathbed, I shall not see Ireland free, but in my children's time it will come. Please God. At the age of 15 years, Michael passed the post office examination and like so many of his compatriots was forced to leave Ireland to secure employment. Ironically, he travelled to London, England and became a boy clerk at this post office savings bank, West Kensington. What was it like for the Irish lad in the great foreign city? He described the feeling himself. A crowd of us were going along the Shepherd's Bush Road when out of a lane came a chap with a donkey, just the sort of donkey and just the sort of cart they have at home. We all cheered him. Nobody who has not been in exile will understand me, but I stand for that. The boy lived here at 5 Netherwood Road. In the late summer of 1914, the First World War broke out. Fundamentally a war between the big nations as to who should control the seas and thereby control the wealth of the world. Collins knew that it was not Ireland's war. He wrote a letter on January the 5th, 1915. This unhappy position in which I find myself, not wanting to be part of an army in which in the past and now has pledged itself to the oppression of Ireland, yet not wanting at the same time to seek the murky honor of being a conscientious objector, America would seem to be the best solution.
Accord you Gael. Ladies and gentlemen of the Irish community in London.
And then he sensed a message from Ireland, a better solution. He burst into a meeting of the London Irish and said, get back to Ireland. Perhaps they could settle the question of freedom on the streets of Dublin. He himself resigned his job and sailed from England on the 15th of January, 1916. Here in the fair city of Dublin, Patrick Pearse, a barrister and poet, and James Connolly, a philosopher amongst others, were whispering of open revolt against the English. These Irish patriots had viewed the alien men, primarily Scottish settlers in the northeast of Ireland, arm themselves with a tacit approval of the English government. England had various formidable vested interests in that northeastern Ireland. And these part-time soldiers were known as the Ulster Volunteers. And so the Irish people armed themselves with the military opposition of the English government, and these were called the Irish Volunteers. But these Irish volunteers were not typical soldiers. They were a strange collection of visionaries and idealists dedicated to the freeing of Ireland from all alien exploitation. Nevertheless, indeed because they were more poet than soldier, at about midday on Easter Monday, April the 24th, 1916, about 300 of these Irish patriots marched through Dublin under the eyes of the English army and occupied a number of the main buildings. They set up their headquarters here in this General Post Office, Dublin, and they called themselves, for the first time, the Irish Republican Army, the IRA. Amongst the rebels in here was Michael Collins, now a very young staff captain. The truth is that very few of the Irish nation supported this quixotic revolt. The vast majority of the Irish people thought of these revolutionaries as a scandalous joke. Indeed, it was as much a shock to the Irish people generally as it was to the English army when it dawned on them what was going on. Suddenly, a flag, the Irish tricolour, went up. And then from out of this post office came Patrick Pearse, and he read a proclamation to the astonished passers-by. Irish men and Irish women, in the name of God and of the dead generations from which he receives her own tradition of nationhood, Ireland through us summons her children to her flag and strikes for her freedom. We pledge our lives and the lives of our comrades in arms to the cause of its freedom. Signed on behalf of the Provisional Government of the Irish Republic. And then the English cordoned off the area and opened fire with every gun they could lay their hands on, including a warship of sorts out there on the River Liffey. Soon they were dead and dying inside this post office, but to the English army's astonishment, the poets and the lawyers and the school teachers hit back and inflicted heavy casualties. One group of English reinforcements lost half their number at the hands of a group of volunteers commanded by a young schoolmaster named Eamon de Valera, today's 84-year-old president of this republic. Days went by and the post office began to burn. James Connolly, poet turned commandant general, was wounded and lay on a stretcher. Michael Collins described what he saw and felt inside this post office. Although I was never actually scared in the GPO, I was, and others also, witless enough to do the most stupid things. As the flames and heat increased, so apparently did the English shelling. Machine gun fire made escape more or less impossible. Not that we wished to escape. No man wished to budge. In that building, the defiance of our men and the gallantry reached unimaginable proportions. Six days later, they were still fighting. One rebel patriot, Carl Brewer, received 25 bullet wounds fighting here in Dublin and lived. People said that as he walked, you could hear the English bullets rattling in him. And then, at 3:45 p.m. on Saturday, 29th of April, 1916, Patrick Pearse, barrister and poet, issued his note of unconditional surrender in order to prevent the further slaughter of Dublin citizens, and in the hope of saving the lives of our followers now surrounded and hopelessly outnumbered. Members of the provisional government present at headquarters have agreed to an unconditional surrender. The Irish prisoners were marched up O'Connell Street, past this Parnell monument, which prophetically quotes the old leader, "No man has the right to fix the boundary to the march of a nation. No man has the right to fix the boundary to the march of a nation. The prisoners were surrounded by a tight ring of fixed bayonets and machine guns pointed at them. The English soldiers dug a giant grave, and gay, boyish Michael Collins became a hard man. He witnessed appalling cruelty. One English officer, though unhappily an Irishman by birth, a Captain Lee Wilson, selected victim after victim, and finally settled on old Tom Clark, who incidentally had spent 16 years of his life in English prisons for political offenses. Captain Wilson had the old patriot stripped in front of watching women and tortured him till he bled. It is recorded that neither Tom Clark nor any of the other victims uttered a word. But Michael Collins watched, and the day came when he found Captain Lee Wilson on a quiet country road in County Wexford, and Michael Collins had him shot dead. The executions which Michael Collins carried out against the English later were never without a terrible reason. We must give him credit for that. And then the detectives of G Division, the political division of the Dublin police, began to make their personal selections for the firing squads. For some extraordinary reason, the English authorities allowed Eamon de Valera to slip through their lethal net. They selected Michael Collins, but with hair-raising coolness, he quietly walked away from the condemned group, and in this way saved his life. English imperialism was to regret that bit of gentle audacity. The English took Michael Collins with 238 other prisoners to Stafford Prison, England, and then to my country's shame, to Frongoch prison camp in North Wales. Eamon de Valera they put into Dartmoor prison with a life sentence. The others, including Patrick Pearse, James Connolly, and old Tom Clark, here in Kilmainham jail without much more ado, they shot. Mortally wounded Connolly, incidentally, they shot tied to a chair. With what daring did the Irish fighters die here in front of the English firing squads? Old Tom Clark wrote that the Irish patriots who have died before me have inspired me with sufficient courage to walk part of the way along that road with an upright head. He and all the others considered their deaths here a very special honor. Michael Collins wrote about the Easter Rising, as it is called. How much I admired the men in the ranks and the women folk thus engaged. The leaders have died nobly at the hands of the firing squad. But I do not think the Rising Week was an appropriate time for the issue of memoranda couched in poetic phrases. It had the air of a Greek tragedy. I would have followed Connolly through hell. I think chiefly of Tom Clark. But on the whole, I think the Rising was bungled terribly, costing many a good life. Michael Collins, the realist, was now fully born. But he was wrong about the effectiveness of that theatrical revolt. When the Irish nation learnt that the English had hastily shot the poet, the lawyer, and philosopher, they stopped laughing at the poet, the lawyer, and philosopher, and turned with a united front of solidarity in hatred against the English army of occupation. That is, all except the Scots, the English, and Welsh settlers who lived in that northeastern part of Ireland, today loosely called Ulster. The Irish poet William Butler Yeats had scoffed unkindly at the freedom fighters of Ireland. Now he too changed his song. He wrote a poem about the Easter Rising, and the poem said, "A terrible beauty is born." The English establishment, or the English government, if one prefers, could not have realized what they were doing when they interned about 2,000 Irish patriots at Frongoch, North Wales. It proved to be the biggest and most efficient training ground ever for the emancipation of Ireland. In Frongoch prison camp, Michael Collins began to exercise and perfect his extraordinary talent for revolutionary leadership. The English naively believed that the spirit of Ireland had been crushed by Easter week and its terrible aftermath. Michael Collins said of his activities at Frongoch, "A scheme of smuggling and communications gives some spice to the usual monotony. Method, but unorthodox, has the British beaten the whole time." One English soldier rather touchingly complained, "If you were bloody cherries, we'd know what to do with you, but you're not." And then the United States of America didn't like the way big England was thumping little Ireland. America began to ask why many men were imprisoned, interned, without charge being made or trial. Incidentally, I'm still speaking about 1916, you understand. Anyway, that question, amongst others, put the wind up England sufficiently that she released Collins and his mates on December the 22nd, 1916. England hoped that they'd be good lads when they got back to Dublin. Crikey. Incidentally, as one might expect, the released Irish prisoners behaved rather naughtily on Chester Station. They loudly sang Deutschland über alles, just to demonstrate that no spirits were broken. Indeed, one of the singers has since confessed, most of us were anti-German, really, and then added with total respect, the British are a patient people that took no notice, and the year was still 1916. Here in Ireland, journalist Arthur Griffith, the childhood inspiration of Michael Collins, who had been released from Reading jail, continued to organize his illegal Sinn Féin political party. Sinn Féin simply means ourselves, or self-reliance. And now, when by-elections occurred for the English Parliament at Westminster, Sinn Féin put up candidates and won. First was Count Plunkett, whose son Joseph had been executed by the English after the Easter Rising. His election leaflet ran, "Whose son was shot against a wall for loving Ireland." Oh, yes, he won. And next, Joseph McGuinness, who was at that time a political prisoner in Lewis Prison, England, he stood for election, and his election poster shows him in convict garb, as you can see, with the slogan, "Put him in to get him out." Oh, yes, he was elected. Eamon de Valera, home from Dartmoor prison, got in. And of course, having won their seats, they all refused to touch the Parliament at Westminster with the longest of shillelaghs. But it gave the English a hint of what the Irish people now thought of them. And so in the month of May 1918, the English decided to throw them all back into prison. De Valera went, Griffith went, and Count Plunkett and most of the others went. But by this time, Michael Collins was very interested in the security game, and therefore he knew that the English were coming for him, and so they didn't catch him. He was now as elusive as Houdini. Indeed, it was said that he knew every chimney pot in Dublin. Nor did they catch his old chum, Harry Boland. Nor did they catch Carl Brewer with his 25 bullet wounds. And so this active trio were left to run things. And they ran them. This was Vaughan's Hotel, Dublin. Today it is the Workers' Union of Ireland. And from this place, Michael Collins began to reorganize the illegal rebel army, the Irish Volunteers. He began to transform them from a political minority to a national army. He took on several other jobs as well, like Minister of Finance, and in great particular, Director of Intelligence. For the next 4 years, he worked between 18 and 20 hours almost every single day, and yet complained, "Oh, the hours we waste in sleep."
We call the meeting to order, gentlemen, and the business of the meeting is to discuss the conditions as set out in the National Wage Agreement, the 14th round.
The English put a price on his head, dead or alive, which finally rose to £10,000. Under this crushing strain, he became a very heavy cigarette smoker, and then suddenly stopped smoking completely, explaining to his awed sister Katie, "I was becoming a slave to cigarettes, I'll be a slave to nothing."
And then, on November the 11th, 1918, Germany surrendered and the First World War was over, and England prepared to turn her imperial might in full against the Irish people. And the Chief of the Imperial General Staff, Field Marshal Sir Henry Wilson, was dead keen. He referred to the Irish volunteers as either murder gangs or rats. And not baboons, as far as I know. But before he could get his military hopes underway, the English government called for a general election on December the 14th, 1918, for the Parliament at Westminster, London. And the cheeky Sinn Féiners, which was the political arm of the Irish Volunteers, decided to contest every single parliamentary seat in Ireland, and out of the 105 seats, they won 73. And then these 73 elected Sinn Féin members of Parliament ignored Westminster and coolly formed a government of their own. And then, under the guns of the English army, on the 21st of January 1919, convened an Irish Parliament called the Dáil Éireann here at this Mansion House, Dublin. Great crowds gathered there, and the world's press was here. What could the poor old English do? It was very embarrassing for a country that had talked so loud and long about freedom and democracy. And worse, hadn't England claimed, amongst other things, that she'd gone to war against Germany to prevent that bully country from even marching across gallant little Belgium? A monstrous lie on England's part, but now potentially very embarrassing. I mean, how could England now march roughshod across gallant little Ireland? And contrary to the will of the majority of the Irish people, eh? Anyway, 27 Irish delegates entered this Mansion House, Dublin. The public rose in emotional response. A prayer opened the proceedings. And when the roll was called, the clerk answered for the majority of those absent. Imprisoned by the English, a declaration of independence was read, and a great concourse of people wept. But it was a depleted gathering. 36 of the elected members of Parliament were at that moment in English prisons. Karl Brewer delivered the opening address in the Irish language. Michael Collins and Harry Boland couldn't be present. They were helping Eamon de Valera to escape from Lincoln Prison in England, which they succeeded in doing. And incidentally, de Valera was voted President of the new Republic of Ireland. And Michael Collins was appointed Minister of Home Affairs. And about that cabinet rank, he remarked, "Our appointments simply ensure the hanging that was only probable had we remained merely members of the Dáil, the Parliament." But then added, "Whether we achieve our object or whether we fail gloriously, a mark has been made that cannot be effaced." And so with the world looking on, and in particular the United States of America,
England almost seemed to accept the Irish Parliament. But suddenly President Woodrow Wilson of the USA refused to support Ireland's entry into the First World War Peace Conference, and England recognized the weakening of Ireland's powerful friend and promptly threw against Ireland a terrible military force. On September the 10th, 1919, England suppressed the Irish Parliament. The Dáil. David Lloyd George, Welsh Prime Minister in England, organized the terror against Ireland. First he sent in the usual spies and informers, and then he sent in an independent volunteer army known as the Auxiliaries. The Auxiliaries, incidentally, were one of Winston Churchill's jolly ideas. They were comparable to Nazi SS troops. They were well-paid ex-British officers, and their motto was to shoot first and ask questions afterwards. They fought hard and efficiently. They also murdered and tortured freely, and the Welshman Lloyd George and the Englishman Winston Churchill turned a couple of blind eyes. Next, Lloyd George and his government sent into Ireland an army called the Black and Tans. Now, it is usually believed that many of these Black and Tans were convicted criminals before leaving England. What is certain is that most of them were worthy of criminal conviction before they left Ireland. The Irish, admiring English efficiency, tended to prefer the barbarism of the Auxiliaries to the obscenities of the Black and Tans. Michael Collins began his work against this new and terrible onslaught by destroying the English spy system. He was able to do this because no Irishman would betray him or dare to betray him. At this time, a Mrs. Lee Doyle was walking across this famous O'Connell Bridge openly with her friend Michael Collins, when to her astonishment, a policeman, rejecting the £10,000 reward, saluted Michael Collins, smiled and said, "Good day, sir." Michael Collins agreed with Mrs. Doyle that this was a queer thingeen. He protected himself by an open, innocent, boyish charm. And of course, the English force didn't know what he looked like, and no one was going to tell them. Michael Collins rode his bicycle through Dublin's fair city every day, organizing the fighting that flared from one end of Ireland to the other. With that £10,000 dead or alive on his head, he lived in an endless series of rooms. This was one of his rooms in Vaughan's Hotel, Dublin. Incidentally, I am told that he had about 100 alternative keys for his various lodgings throughout Dublin. This was one of his exits, through the roof. But sometimes he lived with brave families, particularly the family of Mr. and Mrs. Bat O'Connor. Mrs. O'Connor recalled going through her house in the early hours of one morning to check that all was locked and safe. She noticed that the bedroom door of the room where Michael Collins was sleeping with his friend Harry Boland was open. She looked in and saw the two men asleep, but their bare arms were resting on two small side tables, and their hands were touching two revolvers. Michael Collins had a great capacity for love. It seems that his greatest happiness was to be with children, in whom he placed total trust, and that trust was never broken. Though he was a great hero, the O'Connor children never mentioned at school that Michael Collins lived in their house. He fell in love with at least 3 women during his life, but was a stoic on that subject. One of the ladies once remarked to him that if a woman discovered that her fiancé had an incurable disease, she had the right to call the wedding off. Michael Collins simply picked up his hat and left the room, and as far as I know, never saw her again. But you can see Michael Collins with old people. Great age holds something for me that is awesome. I am much fonder of old people in the darkness than I am of young people in the daylight.
Mick Collins set up his intelligence organization here in Crow Street, calling it the Irish Products Company. Unhappily, no one now seems to know what became of it. Dublin Castle, the old thick heart of English power, is 200 yards up the road. He organized his own men inside this Dublin Castle. In here, a young detective named Ned Broy typed many of the top security reports for the English. Ned Broy always fed into his typewriter 2 carbon papers, 1 copy for the English masters and another copy for Michael Collins.
Collins had his own men working in government departments in London. He mastered the cipher codes of the English police, military, and the castle, and his personal audacity was hair-raising. One night, he secured entry into this English detective headquarters here in Brunswick Street, Dublin, now very properly renamed Pierce Street. It was his double agent, Detective Ned Broy, who brought him in here, presumably nodding bonhomie to the heavy brigade behind the desk. Then they entered this very room where the police records were kept, and Michael Collins spent most of that night going through those records and making his notes. And when he left, just before dawn, he naughtily pinched the detective's daybook as a souvenir. And that is an historical fact. But when Collins and his lads caught an English spy, they usually shot him. However, not always. One English spy received a note which read, if you value your life, the first boat from Ireland is at 7:30 in the morning. And then Lloyd George, and Winston Churchill was not disinterested, permitted a wild adventure which proved to be regrettable. A number of British officers were recruited and were dispatched to Dublin with categorical orders to locate and destroy Collins and his organization. Inevitably, Collins got wind of this dangerous expedition. He investigated and then called a final meeting here at Vaughan's Hotel on Saturday night, November the 20th, 1920. On Sunday, November the 21st, Michael Collins sent out 8 groups of his men who called on these English spies, etc., in their various lodgings throughout Dublin, and Collins' men then summarily and messily executed 14 of them. The English auxiliaries reacted in their own way. Lorry loads of them drove up here to Croke Park in the afternoon, where a large crowd of Irish people were watching a football match. The auxiliaries pointed their machine guns and fired point blank. "14 persons, men, women, and children were killed, including 1 player on this spot." And then Michael Collins was informed that the auxiliaries had captured 2 of his best men, Peter Clancy and Dick McKee, together with a totally innocent young man, Connor Clune. Collins was horrified at their potential fate at the hands of the raging auxiliaries. Sean Kavanagh was in Vaughan's Hotel that evening, sitting next to Connor Clune. Sean Kavanagh's fate that night was precarious. Sean Kavanagh, agent and train raider for Michael Collins. Collins sent for his double agent, Detective David Nelligan, and asked him to find out where the auxiliaries were holding Clancy and McKee. David Nelligan bluffed his way into Bridewell prison and hurried from cell to cell. They were not there. The 3 prisoners were here in this guard room of Dublin Castle, And in this room they were obscenely tortured by a Captain Hardy and his auxiliary associates. The three men crawled to this fireplace, and it was here on this spot that they were finally killed. Mr. Edward Lane was, indeed still is, one of Michael Collins' men, and he today looks after this room. An astounding end to this dreadful story is that on the day of the funeral, here in the pro-cathedral Dublin, with detectives on the lookout in every corner, Michael Collins suddenly appeared from amongst the mourners, dressed in a trench coat, they say, and pinned a note on the coffins. The note read, "In memory of two good friends, Dick and Peter, and two of Ireland's best soldiers, Michael Collins, 25th of November, 1920. And then the big man was gone. And in Brixton Prison, England, Terence McSweeney, Lord Mayor of Cork, had gone on hunger strike. And good old Winston Churchill made one of his famous jokes. He said, it was during the silly season the Lord Mayor of Cork announced his determination to starve himself to death. He did not want to die. After 6 weeks fasting, the Lord Mayor of Cork is still alive." And then Terence McSweeney died for his principles, and Winston Churchill apparently lacked the grace to apologize. 1 month later, on the 23rd of December 1920, Lloyd George took the most terrible political action. Against the will of the vast majority of the Irish people, he divided the country into two parts, Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland. He did this for strategic and economic reasons and to appease the primarily Protestant Scottish settlers of the northeast. Expediency rarely settles anything. Lloyd George. Michael Collins described this division, the border as it is now called, as this plunderous and impossible act. Around the world, people were shocked at England's brutal oppression in Ireland, and even Lloyd George had had enough. And he asked Eamon de Valera to agree to a truce, which was finally arranged to begin on July the 11th, 1921. Most people were relieved at the truce, but not the English chief of the Imperial General Staff, General Sir Henry Wilson, and not Michael Collins. General Wilson was frustrated. It stopped him exterminating the Irish rats, as he insisted on calling the Irish patriots. And Michael Collins realized what the truce could do to his underground freedom fighters. He said, it is extermination for us. If the truce should fail, we shall be like rabbits coming out of their holes. But the truce did not stop General Wilson making his extermination calculations. Very interesting and surprising calculations to exterminate rats. General Wilson said, we shall want 100,000 to 200,000 men and 1 or 2 years to stamp out the murder gang and re-establish law and order. Old General Wilson was a right old empire builder, wasn't he? Getting on for 250,000 soldiers and 2 years to destroy a so-called murder gang. Oh, what a bully boy. Mark you, General Wilson had never been a sensitive lad. During the First World War, he had lost over 1,000 of his men on one single day, and he had described that as a nasty little knock. Of course, one of the optimistic facts about human affairs is that it usually takes a lot of people on the wrong side to beat a few people on the right side. By the way, I am afraid the truth is that Michael Collins gave General Wilson himself a nasty little knock.
He had him shot dead outside this is house here in Belgravia, the posher part of London. But the truce had not helped the Catholics in Northern Ireland. With its coming, Catholics were murdered and removed from their homes and jobs. Michael Collins remarked that the truce had broken out up there. De Valera wrote to Lloyd George on the subject of Northern Ireland. We cannot admit the right of the British government to mutilate our country, neither in its own interest or at the call of any section of our population. Michael Collins appealed to the Protestants of Northern Ireland, quote, to join with us as Irishmen, to come into the Irish nation, to come in and take their share in the government of their own country, unquote. C.P. Scott, the great Manchester journalist, appealed to Lloyd George personally. He told him that the Northern Ireland government was not fit to govern, of the formation of a dangerous Protestant police force, of the expulsion of thousands from the shipyards simply because they were Catholics. And Lloyd George did nothing. Eamon de Valera, who has always behaved with the careful subtlety of a Jesuit, and Lloyd George, who always behaved like a political Billy Graham, and I don't mean that as a compliment, had long chats together here in London. Finally, Lloyd George issued an invitation to the Irish rebel government to attend a conference in London on October the 11th, 1921, to try and settle the sickly truce. De Valera accepted with ever so carefully selected words.
The Irish Republic would be glad to discuss this question with a community of nations known as the British Empire.
But who would go to this conference? Well, Eamon de Valera was in a dodgy predicament, but then he was the expert in getting out of dodgy predicaments, whether they were English firing squads or English jails, and now a cunning Welsh Prime Minister. You see, Eamon de Valera had stated that he was a Republican, and he knew very well from his chats with Lloyd George that the English would not allow Ireland to become a republic. And he also knew that it would be very bad for his political future to fail. So he simply refused to go. And then there was the uncompromising Republican, Karl Brewer. Well, he had 25 good bullet reasons not to look at any Englishman unless it was to kill him. Indeed, Karl Brewer, at the height of the English atrocities here in Ireland, had put forward a serious proposal that the entire British cabinet should be assassinated by Rota. Michael Collins turned on his old comrade and said, "You get none of my men for that." And Karl Brewer made the sinister reply, "I don't need any of your men." And so Eamon de Valera pointed the finger of choice at Arthur Griffith and Michael Collins, together with 3 other Irish delegates. Michael Collins was appalled. He said, "I am a soldier, not a politician." And Arthur Griffith also began to understand the score. He said to Eamon de Valera, with Karl Brewer in the room, "You are my chief. If you tell me to go, I'll go. But I know, and you know, that I cannot bring back the Republic." And it began to dawn on Collins and Griffith that not only were they heading for London to talk to the leaders of the enemy, but that in the persons of their old comrades, Eamon de Valera and Karl Brewer, they were not, perhaps, leaving behind in Dublin the best friends they had in the world. Michael Collins went to church and made his confession. He said to the priest, "Father, say a mass for Ireland." And by that, of course, he meant the northern part of Ireland as well. In London, Michael Collins stayed here at 15 Cadogan Gardens. He was a very unhappy man. He wrote, You might say the trap is sprung, but there is no record of Michael Collins turning his back on anything ever. Not on the enemy here in London, nor the potential enemy back in Dublin. The truth is that Karl Brewer, the bullet-scarred Republican fanatic, was consumed with a bitter hatred for Michael Collins. He resented his fame and therefore was an extremely dangerous man to have at base. While in London, Sir John Lavery painted Michael Collins' portrait. Sir John recalled, Collins was a patient sitter, but I noticed that he liked to sit facing the door. He was always on the alert.
The British delegation comprised of Prime Minister Lloyd George, Chancellor of the Exchequer Sir Austin Chamberlain, the Secretary of State for the Colonies Winston Churchill, the Lord Chancellor of Great Britain Lord Birkenhead, and 3 others. Apart from the renegade Welshmen, all were naturally public school or university men. The British delegation was supplied, presumably by the civil service, with an assessment of the Irish delegation. Part of it read, quote, "They are leaders in Dáil Éireann, which is a very nondescript assembly. They are absolutely without world experience, maybe a bit rude and extravagant in speech." Unquote.
Well, that is the English ruling class view in a nutshell. Arrogant. And inaccurate. Michael Collins and Arthur Griffith entered this conference room and looked across the table at these rulers of a quarter of the Earth's surface. Collins wrote to a friend, "I've come here to call a spade a spade. It's the only name I know it by." He looked at Lloyd George and Winston Churchill and wrote, "To be a politician, one needs to have the ability to say one thing and mean another. One needs to be abnormally successful in the art of twisting the truth. Can you wonder that I think and yet never manage to achieve peace of mind? I do not in the least care for the false atmosphere of these discussions." Michael Collins described what he observed in each of his adversaries across the table. This is a real nest of singing birds. They chirrup mightily one to the other, and there's the falseness of it all, because not one trusts the other. Lloyd George's attitude I find to be particularly obnoxious. It's all comradely, all craft and wiliness, all arm around the shoulder, all the old pals act. Now Michael, he says, or now Mick. Not long ago he would joyfully have had me at the rope's end. He thinks the past is all washed up now, but that's to my face. What he thinks behind my back makes me sick at the thought. And then on the character of Winston Churchill. Outlook, political gain. Will sacrifice all for political gain. Inclined to be bombastic, full of ex-officer jingo. Don't actually trust him. The British delegation were offering dominion status to Ireland. In terms of emancipation, it was a tremendous step forward for the Irish people. It meant, above all things, that after 700 years, English soldiers would leave. But there would be the residual of shame. A British Governor-General and an oath of allegiance to the British sovereign. Also, and by far the most serious threat, a final partitioning of the small island of Ireland. The primarily Scottish settlers of the northeast of Ireland were not only rejecting the offer of warm hospitality from the Irish people, but were threatening an armed insurrection if they failed to get a border. On this issue of a border, Lloyd George had been grossly dishonest to the Irish people. As early as 1916, he had informed Sir Edward Carson, whose violent methods to destroy a united Ireland were despicable, that Ulster will not, whether she wills it or not, merge in the rest of Ireland. And then in the same week, he said to the leader of the Irish Parliamentary Party, I give my pledge that there will be no permanent partition of Ireland. Lloyd George was a deceiver on this issue of the border. One day people would have to pay for his mentality and the mentality of his English associates. On the subject of the threatened border, Michael Collins spelt out the facts in simple language. He stated, the 6 counties of Ulster are held in sway not by any patriotic allegiance towards England. Scottish element in population and money interests account to a large extent for the supposed allegiance. Protestant element is enforced. Catholic population subdued. Ireland is Ireland. Borderland is trouble. And always will be. Lloyd George worked hard in deceiving particularly Arthur Griffith that there would be no lasting border. Griffith made the monstrous mistake of believing the words of Lloyd George, and both Churchill and Birkenhead were involved in similar deception. And then the debate swung to the relatively unimportant subject of the oath of allegiance to the British monarch. Words were invented that carried a minimum of shame for the Irish. And then Lloyd George collared Michael Collins and made the stupid mistake of trying to tempt him, as if he had been of the caliber of one of his own British imperial delegation. He pointed to maps of the British Empire. And putting his arm round Michael Collins' shoulder, said, you're a capable man, Mick. Supposing you help us. Well, Lloyd George and Winston Churchill and company were in the presence of their betters. That is, if we can manage to erase the delusion of fame and power. Michael Collins and Arthur Griffith knew how much England had offered, and knew exactly why England had offered anything. Michael Collins stated, world opinion has forced them to take the step of these conferences. They want to clear their name with the world. Lloyd George and company would give nothing more than dominion status and a deceit that Ireland would be united. Michael Collins wanted a republic as much as anyone and to be rid of English oppression forever. But he knew that he would not get the republic in 1921. Lloyd George then spoke his truth. Sign this treaty, or there will be terrible military retribution on Ireland. And he gave them 3 days to decide. Are you prepared to accept? Arthur Griffith broke and said, we do. Lloyd George had looked at Michael Collins and had said, my political life is at stake. Collins made no reply, but has confessed that he thought, my life, not only political, is at stake. But Collins believed that this treaty was the best the Irish would get from the Welsh-led English, and he signed. Winston Churchill described Michael Collins at this terrible moment. He rose, looking as if he was going to shoot someone, preferably himself. In all my life, I have never seen so much passion and suffering in restraint. And after signing the treaty, Michael Collins wrote to a friend, "What have I got for Ireland? Something she has wanted these past 700 years. Will anyone be satisfied with the bargain? I tell you this, early this morning, I signed my death warrant." He was thinking of his sometime Republican comrade Carl Brewer back in Dublin. Perhaps he was also thinking of Eamon de Valera. De Valera's reaction to the treaty was sharp and immediate. He said, "I feel it my duty to inform you immediately that I cannot recommend the acceptance of this treaty." And he included Carl Brewer in his crushing rejection. Bullet-scarred Carl Brewer bitterly and enviously attacked Michael Collins in the Irish Parliament in this new Dáil. He stooped pretty low when he asked, "Can it be authoritatively stated that Michael Collins ever fired a shot at an enemy of Ireland?" Whatever the answer to that question is, Michael Collins had certainly risked his life for Ireland every single day for 4 years. In reply, dedicated, self-effacing Arthur Griffith said, "If my name is to go down in history, I want it associated with the name of Michael Collins." A tragic destiny was now inevitable, and all because there was a theoretical difference of opinion between the realists, Michael Collins and Arthur Griffith on the one hand, and the idealists, personified by Carl Brewer and the politician Eamon de Valera on the other, over their united love for Ireland. They all believed that there would one day be a united Ireland. They were not primarily worried about Northern Ireland, even those who were not taken in by the deceit of Lloyd George and his associates. They were really preparing to fight each other because of the missing word republic, and because of the wording of the oath of allegiance to the English crown, which they all understandably thoroughly despised. The Irish Parliament voted on the treaty. The awful truth was that they were also voting as to which side each person would be in a coming civil war to be fought between old comrades. Great crowds were hushed as the votes were spoken like death sentences. For the treaty, Michael Collins, Arthur Griffith. Against the treaty, Eamon de Valera, Carl Brewer, and Michael Collins' old close friend, Harry Boland. The result of the poll, 64 approved the treaty, 57 against the treaty. The civil war was evenly matched. Eamon de Valera resigned his presidency and finally walked out of the Parliament, the Dáil, followed by his supporters. Michael Collins untypically shouted after them, "Deserters all!" But afterwards he turned sharply on a critic of de Valera, saying, "Leave him alone. If you can't say anything good about him, then don't say anything about him." Arthur Griffith was elected the new president. On January the 6th, 1922, Dublin Castle was formally handed over to Michael Collins. He wrote, "The castle is now ours. It has been a place of terror in the past, symbolizing, probably because of its contents, the English, all that oppression could offer. It ought to be treasured as a national memorial to freedom." On St. Patrick's Day, 1922, Eamon de Valera made a frightening, rebellious speech. He said his followers would have to wade through Irish blood, through the blood of the soldiers of the Irish government, and through perhaps the blood of some of the members of the government in order to get Irish freedom. On the 13th of April, 1922, Eamon de Valera's anti-treaty men began to take over strategic buildings in Dublin, and in particular, this forecourts. Michael Collins grew old at the prospect of civil war. He tried to come to terms with De Valera, and as a result, Lloyd George sent for Collins and Arthur Griffith and threatened a return of British troops if the anti-treaty men in the forecourts and such places were not removed. Winston Churchill made one of his speeches: "If it does not come to an end, if through weakness, want of courage, or some less creditable reason, we shall regard the treaty as having been formally violated." No murmur of compassion. And of course that Churchillian threat would mean the return of what? The black and tan mentality. And Churchill also added, "I do not understand why they do not ring them round and starve them out." And Michael Collins replied, "Let Churchill come over and do his own dirty work." But the imperial bully boy was too awful a prospect, and on June the 28th, Michael Collins' soldiers opened fire on their old comrades in the forecourts. They used British 18-pounder field guns. It could be argued that these were the first shots fired in the Civil War. And suddenly theoretical differences of political opinion became old comrade killing old comrade. Karl Brewer, of course, would not surrender. His building was pounded by shells and caught fire. Someone heard Karl Brewer say, "They'll never get me." He came through the flames firing a Thompson machine gun. A Lewis gunner covering the exit replied, and Karl Brewer was no more. Michael Collins grew visibly old. He said, "I would forgive Karl Brewer anything. At worst, he was a fanatic. At best, I number him among the very few who have given their all that this country should have its freedom. When many of us have forgotten, Karl Brewer will be remembered." And then he added, "There was one brave man amongst them." Michael Collins was now Commander-in-Chief of the Army, and it was the most terrible time of his life. On July the 28th, 1922, he wrote a letter to his old friend Harry Boland, who was now fighting against him. He wrote, "Harry, it has come to this. Of all things, it has come to this. It is in my power to arrest and destroy you. This I cannot do. You are marching under false colors. If no words of mine will change your attitude, then you are above all hope, my hope." But 3 days later, Harry Boland was fatally shot by Michael Collins' soldiers. And as he died, he simply said, "Bury me beside Karl Brewer." It was, as Collins had once said, like a Greek tragedy, but worse. This was a terrible reality. Michael Collins thought of his youth and said, I was young then and nice. And now I am old and not so nice." He was 32 years old. He said, "I'll send a wreath, only I suppose they'd return it torn up." And then the big man, the big fella, Michael Collins, wept unrestrainedly. On August the 12th, Arthur Griffith, unbending man of freedom and gentle courtesy, suddenly died. Irish brother killing Irish brother because of some face-saving English stipulation was more than his being could take. Now at the funeral, Michael Collins walked as the head of government as well as Commander-in-Chief of the Army. The great crowds who watched were shocked at the grim change of his demeanor. Afterwards, he announced that he would make a tour of inspection of his army garrisons. This, of course, meant traveling amidst the conflict. He said to a friend,
I'm going to try and bring the boys around, adding as if it were a game. If not, I shall have to get rough with them. That was the Irish Civil War. An old friend, Joe O'Reilly, who loved Michael Collins, saw him waiting for his armored car. Michael wore a small green kit bag over his back. His head was bent in gloomy meditation. I'd never seen him so tragically dejected, letting himself fall slack in the loneliness and silence of the summer's morning. On August the 22nd, 1922, he had reached his home county, Cork. As he left his hotel at 10 minutes past 6 in the morning, he remarked to a friend, Joe Dolan, "I believe Dev's knocking around this area," meaning Eamon de Valera. First, there was a motorcyclist scout, then a tender with 2 officers, 8 riflemen, and 2 machine guns, then a touring car with General Michael Collins, Major General Dalton, and 2 men, and finally a Rolls-Royce armored car with 2 men. Their journey took them to Collins' home village, Sam's Cross. He pointed out the ruins of his home cottage, destroyed by Major Percival and his soldiers of Essex. At Sam's Cross, members of his family came out to talk to him. A cousin who was landlord of this inn, the Four Alls, gave every man a drink of the local stout. This is the same Jeremiah Collins today. Michael O'Brien, first cousin to Michael Collins, was there and was exactly Michael Collins' age. Today, he is 82 years old. Liam Collins. Then a 3-year-old nephew was there. Mrs. Mary O'Hay, first cousin of Michael Collins, was there, and as the convoy moved away, Michael Collins waved and said, "Goodbye, Mary," and then added, "Well, no man will kill me in this, my part of Ireland." The convoy drove off and came to this valley called Baile na Blá, which means Pass of the Flowers. The valley was gloomy, and someone saw Michael Collins instinctively lift a rifle onto his lap. They came to this blind corner, and suddenly in front of them across the road, a 4-wheeled brewer's dray. Immediately, machine guns opened fire on the convoy. The commander of the convoy, Major General Dalton, shouted, "Drive like hell!" And Michael Collins, head of the Irish government, commander-in-chief of the army, replied, "Get out and fight!" And he fought on this road, on this spot, with a rifle. The battle raged, and suddenly the firing ceased. Michael Collins stood up, reloaded his rifle, and looked around. There was a single shot, and the leader of Ireland was pierced through the head and died instantly. The local priest, Father O'Sullivan, came to this awful place, and here on this roadway, illuminated by the armored car's headlights, performed his solemn duty. Here in Kilmainham Prison, Dublin, there were over 1,000 Irish anti-treaty prisoners, all captured by Michael Collins' soldiers. Amongst those prisoners was Commandant General Tom Barry. He described what happened when the news reached this prison that the enemy leader, Michael Collins, who had captured them all, was dead. There was a sudden heavy silence throughout the jail. It continued for 10 minutes. Then from this corridor, outside this top tier of cells, I heard a great murmur. I looked down onto an extraordinary spectacle. There below me were about 1,000 kneeling Republican prisoners, spontaneously speaking the rosary aloud for the repose of the soul of the dead Michael Collins. They brought his body to this city hall where it lay in state. Thousands of weeping people paid their homage. The body was taken to the Pro Cathedral. The body was taken down O'Connell Street, where the flower sellers placed their flowers on his coffin. The cortege was 3 miles long. And then here to Glasnevin Cemetery to be buried. George Bernard Shaw wrote a letter to Michael Collins' sister. My dear Miss Collins, don't let them make you miserable about it. How could a born soldier die better than at the victorious end of a good fight? Fall into the shot of another Irishman, a damn fool, but all the same an Irishman who thought he was fighting for Ireland. I rejoice in Michael's memory and will not be so disloyal to it as to snivel over his valiant death. So tear up your mourning and hang up your brightest colours in his honour. And let us all praise God that he had not to die in a snuffy bed of a trumpery cough, weakened by age. Sincerely, Bernard Shaw, 24th of August, 1922.